Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are not chasing battles, revolutions, or great men shouting speeches into history. Instead, we are stepping into something far quieter, far gentler, and strangely far more powerful. A cup. A saucer. A kettle beginning to whisper. Tonight's story is about how something as ordinary as tea came to rule an entire city's rhythm, manners, and sense of self. This is the story of how afternoon tea in 19th century London became not just a habit, but a social force, one that shaped identity, class, and daily life in ways most people never stop to consider. At first glance, afternoon tea sounds harmless. Pleasant, even. A pause in the day. A warm drink shared politely. But in Victorian London, tea was never just tea. It was a signal. A test. A performance. A quiet declaration of who you were, where you stood, and whether you belonged. To miss tea was not simply to miss a drink. It was to fall out of step with the carefully measured heartbeat of society itself. By the early 1800s, London was a city of contrasts. Smoke-darkened streets pressed up against elegant drawing rooms. Industrial noise clashed with strict ideas of order and refinement. Life moved fast, but social rules moved slowly, clinging to tradition as if stability itself might dissolve without them. In this world, afternoon tea emerged as something more than refreshment. It became an anchor, a predictable ritual in a city increasingly defined by uncertainty. The structure of the Victorian day left a long, awkward gap between meals. Lunch was light. Dinner, especially among the middle and upper classes, was pushed later and later into the evening. Hunger alone, however, does not explain what tea became. Plenty of societies have snacks. Only a few turn them into ceremonies layered with meaning. What transformed tea from a simple solution into a cultural obsession was not appetite, but anxiety. Victorian London was obsessed with appearances. Respectability mattered deeply, especially as the growing middle class tried to distinguish itself from both the aristocracy above and the laboring poor below. Tea offered a way to perform respectability without overt wealth. You did not need a grand estate to serve tea. You needed manners. Timing. The right gestures. The correct tone of voice. Tea allowed people to demonstrate refinement in small, repeatable ways, every single day. Afternoon tea became a shared script. Everyone knew the lines. The kettle boiled at the proper hour. Cups were arranged. Guests arrived knowing exactly how long to stay and how much to consume. Nothing about it was spontaneous. And that was the point. In a rapidly changing city, predictability was comfort. Tea time created a controlled environment where behavior could be measured, corrected, and quietly judged. To sit at a tea table was to enter a space governed by rules so subtle they were almost invisible. How you held your cup mattered. How long you waited before sipping mattered. Whether you spoke too much or too little mattered. Tea provided a socially acceptable arena for observation. People watched one another carefully, noting confidence, restraint, and familiarity with unspoken customs. A well-conducted tea suggested a well-conducted life. This ritual also softened the sharp edges of social hierarchy while reinforcing it at the same time. Tea gatherings could include neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances from slightly different social levels. Everyone sat close together, but not equally. Seating arrangements, serving order, and even who was invited in the first place quietly reaffirmed rank. Tea did not challenge class structure. It made it feel natural. Importantly, tea was repetitive. It happened daily, sometimes multiple times a day. That repetition mattered. Social norms are not learned once. They are reinforced over and over through practice. Afternoon tea trained people. Children absorbed rules by watching adults. Newcomers learned by imitation. Those who failed to adapt felt the consequences not through confrontation, but through silence, exclusion, or subtle disapproval. Tea also created a rhythm that shaped time itself. The afternoon was no longer an empty stretch of hours. It was something you moved toward. Appointments were scheduled around it. Errands were timed to avoid it. Conversations paused for it. The clock bent slightly in its presence. In this way, tea did what churches, factories, and schools also did in Victorian society. It organized time into meaningful blocks, giving structure to days that might otherwise feel overwhelming. What made tea especially powerful was its calm surface. Unlike formal dinners or public events, tea appeared gentle and domestic. This made its social pressure harder to resist and easier to accept. No one announced the rules. They were simply how things were done. To question them would be awkward. To ignore them would be noticeable. Compliance felt voluntary, even when it was not. The obsession with afternoon tea also reflected a deeper Victorian belief that order in small things created order in large ones. If society could not control factories, politics, or empire without tension, it could at least control teaspoons, napkins, and conversation. Tea became a symbol of moral steadiness. A household that managed tea well appeared stable, disciplined, and trustworthy. This is why tea was not treated as trivial. It was woven into identity. Being good at tea meant being socially competent. Hosting a smooth tea gathering enhanced reputation. Failing at it invited quiet speculation. The tea table became a place where character was assessed, without anyone ever saying so aloud. Over time, this obsession spread beyond private homes into public life. Tea rooms, gardens, and parlors extended the ritual into shared spaces. Even there, the same expectations followed. The performance simply had a larger audience. People learned to sit, sip, and speak as if always observed, because in a way, they were. By the middle of the 19th century, tea had become a cultural language. You could say things with tea that you could not say directly. Invitations implied alliances. Repeated absences implied distance. The quality of the tea, the care taken in serving it, even the choice of snacks communicated intention. Tea spoke softly, but it spoke constantly. And so, afternoon tea in Victorian London was never just a pause in the day. It was a mirror of society itself. A place where comfort and control met. Where warmth coexisted with judgment. Where something as simple as boiling water became a way to manage a complicated world. As we move deeper into this story, we will see how this ritual shaped behavior, reinforced power, and turned everyday objects into symbols of belonging. But it all begins here, with the realization that in 19th century London, a cup of tea was not an accessory to life. It was one of the ways life made sense. And somewhere in the background, the kettle was always waiting to boil again. After understanding how tea became a social ritual, it becomes easier to see why it mattered so deeply on a more personal level. Victorian London was not a comfortable place to wake up in. Long before central heating, electric light, or insulated walls, mornings arrived cold, dim, and demanding. The day did not begin gently. It began with endurance. And in that context, tea was not a luxury. It was a form of quiet survival. The typical Victorian morning started early, often before sunrise, especially in winter. Bedrooms were unheated. Windows leaked cold air. Frost sometimes formed on the inside of glass. Getting out of bed required real effort, not just willpower. Clothes were stiff with chill. Water for washing was cold unless heated by hand. Even simple acts demanded energy before the body had fully woken. Warmth was scarce, and comfort was brief. Food, too, was unreliable as comfort. Breakfasts varied widely by class, but even among those who could afford decent meals, mornings were rushed and functional. Heavy food early in the day was not always appealing in cold, dim conditions. What people wanted most was not fullness but warmth. Something to hold. Something to steady the body and mind before the long hours ahead. This is where tea quietly took control of the morning. It was warm. It was predictable. It required waiting, which slowed the pace of the moment. The simple act of heating water and pouring it over leaves created a pause in an otherwise demanding start to the day. Steam rising from a cup offered reassurance before the day asked for anything in return. For many Victorians, especially in cities, tea was the first real comfort they experienced each morning. Before conversations began, before work intruded, before expectations tightened their grip, there was tea. It warmed the hands. It softened the throat. It brought a sense of order to a world that often felt physically hostile. The emotional role of tea in the morning should not be underestimated. Victorian culture placed enormous value on self-control. Displays of fatigue, frustration, or vulnerability were discouraged. People were expected to meet the day composed and capable, regardless of how they felt. Tea acted as a buffer between private discomfort and public performance. It offered a moment to collect oneself before stepping into the role society required. In crowded London households, mornings could be noisy and tense. Multiple generations often shared small spaces. Servants moved quickly. Children prepared for lessons. Adults readied themselves for work or social duties. Tea provided a shared focal point, a brief alignment of rhythms. Even when taken separately, it synchronized the household's emotional temperature. The physical properties of tea mattered as much as the ritual around it. It was hot enough to warm the body, but gentle enough to be consumed quickly. Unlike heavier drinks, it did not slow movement or dull alertness. Victorians believed strongly in moderation, and tea fit neatly into that belief. It comforted without indulgence. It energized without excess. Over time, tea became associated with clarity and steadiness. A person who began the day with tea was seen as sensible, disciplined, and prepared. Skipping it felt unsettling, like missing a step on a staircase. The body noticed. The mind noticed. The day felt slightly off balance. This reliance on tea was reinforced by routine. The human brain finds comfort in repetition, especially under stress. Victorian life, particularly in urban settings, was filled with unpredictability. Industrial schedules, financial pressures, and social expectations collided daily. Tea offered something reliable. It tasted the same. It arrived at the same time. It asked nothing except patience while it brewed. Even the act of waiting for tea mattered. In a culture that prized restraint, waiting calmly for water to boil and leaves to steep was a daily exercise in self-control. It was a small rehearsal for larger expectations. Sit. Wait. Do not rush. Do not complain. The reward will come. Tea also functioned as a quiet mental reset. Before newspapers were read or letters answered, before decisions were made, tea allowed thoughts to settle. Many Victorians believed that clear thinking required calm nerves. Tea, warm and familiar, was thought to steady the mind. Whether or not this was scientifically accurate mattered less than the belief itself. For those living alone or working long hours, tea offered companionship of a different kind. The ritual filled silence. The warmth countered isolation. A single cup on a small table could transform an empty room into something more bearable. In this way, tea served not only the body, but the emotions, without ever acknowledging that need openly. Importantly, this comfort was socially acceptable. Seeking warmth or rest directly might appear weak. Drinking tea did not. It was framed as proper, productive, and respectable. You were not pausing because you were tired. You were pausing because it was tea time. The ritual protected vulnerability behind tradition. As the morning passed into afternoon, the effects of that first cup lingered. Tea set the tone. It reminded people that order was possible, even if briefly. That the day had a structure. That comfort could exist within discipline. This emotional foundation made the later, more formal afternoon tea feel like a continuation rather than an interruption. The widespread dependence on tea also shaped expectations. Hosts were judged not only on hospitality, but on whether tea was available promptly. A delayed kettle suggested disorganization. A weak brew implied carelessness. Morning tea, though informal compared to afternoon gatherings, still reflected character. Over years and decades, generations grew up associating tea with safety and normality. Children watched adults begin their days this way and internalized the message, "This is how mornings work. This is how you prepare yourself for the world." Tea became part of emotional education, teaching patience, routine, and quiet resilience. By anchoring the day in warmth and familiarity, tea helped Victorians face environments that were often physically uncomfortable and emotionally demanding. It did not solve problems. It did not remove hardship. But it softened the edges just enough to make endurance possible. So when we imagine Victorian London moving through foggy streets and narrow rooms, we should picture not only factories and carriages, but countless small cups raised to cold lips at dawn. In those moments, tea was not a symbol of status or empire. It was something simpler and more human. A steady presence. A reassurance that, at least for now, warmth was within reach. And as the day continued, that need for reassurance would return again, this time dressed in finer cups, sharper rules, and watchful eyes waiting patiently for the afternoon bell to quietly announce that it was, once more, time for tea. By the time the afternoon arrived, tea was no longer about survival or simple comfort. The day had warmed slightly. The body had adjusted. What remained was something far more delicate and far more dangerous. Society. Afternoon tea marked the moment when private endurance gave way to public visibility, and where tea transformed from a personal anchor into a social instrument. In Victorian London, afternoon tea was rarely consumed alone by accident. It was designed, expected, and quietly anticipated as a moment of connection. But connection, in this world, did not always mean closeness. More often, it meant observation. Tea gatherings created a space where people could come together without admitting why they were truly there, to be seen, to measure others, and to be measured in return. Conversation at the tea table appeared light. Polite remarks about the weather, recent outings, or shared acquaintances floated gently through the room. But beneath this surface calm, something sharper moved. Afternoon tea functioned as a subtle checkpoint, a moment when reputations were tested without formal judgment. Who attended? Who did not? Who was invited again? Who quietly faded from the circle? All of it mattered. Unlike formal dinners, which followed rigid protocols and clear hierarchies, afternoon tea occupied an in-between space. It felt relaxed enough to invite participation, yet structured enough to enforce boundaries. This balance made it ideal for social evaluation. People were expected to speak, but not too boldly. To listen, but not too passively. To reveal personality, but only within safe limits. Gossip flourished in this environment, not as loud accusation, but as careful suggestion. A raised eyebrow. A pause before a sentence finished. A change of subject at just the right moment. Information moved slowly and quietly, disguised as concern or curiosity. Tea provided the perfect cover. After all, people were merely talking. What made afternoon tea especially powerful was its repetition. These gatherings happened frequently, sometimes daily among close circles. Small impressions accumulated over time. A single awkward comment might be forgiven. A pattern would not. Tea allowed society to form conclusions gradually, giving judgments the appearance of inevitability rather than intention. Hierarchy was present at every tea table, even when denied. Who poured the tea mattered. Who chose the cups mattered. Who sat closest to the host mattered. These details communicated rank without words. Guests understood their position instinctively, adjusting posture, tone, and confidence accordingly. Tea did not create hierarchy. It displayed it. For women especially, afternoon tea was a primary arena of social influence. In a world where formal power was limited, the tea table became a place to build alliances, manage reputations, and shape narratives. Hosting a successful tea enhanced social standing. Failing to do so invited quiet speculation. Tea allowed women to exercise authority while appearing entirely domestic. Men, when present, navigated a different set of expectations. Too much dominance felt inappropriate. Too little engagement suggested indifference. Tea required balance. Those who understood the rhythm of conversation and restraint demonstrated social intelligence. Those who did not stood out, often without realizing why. The rules governing these interactions were rarely taught explicitly. Children learned by watching. Newcomers learned by making mistakes. This lack of formal instruction ensured that social knowledge remained a form of capital. Those raised within the system moved effortlessly. Outsiders struggled, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned they might be. Tea also functioned as a form of social filtering. Invitations were extended carefully. A guest list reflected not only friendship, but strategy. Hosting someone signaled approval. Excluding someone sent a message just as clearly. Because tea was framed as casual, these decisions avoided confrontation. One could always claim circumstances or convenience. Even silence at the tea table carried meaning. What was not said often mattered more than what was spoken. Avoided topics hinted at discomfort. Lingering pauses suggested disagreement. Tea encouraged reading between the lines, training participants to interpret subtle cues. Over time, this sharpened social awareness while increasing anxiety. The emotional cost of this constant evaluation was rarely acknowledged. Afternoon tea was pleasant on the surface, but demanding beneath it. To sit calmly while being observed required effort. To maintain composure while navigating shifting alliances required skill. Yet because tea was associated with leisure, this labor went unrecognized. Tea gatherings also reinforced conformity. Those who expressed unconventional opinions learned quickly to soften them. Those who dressed differently noticed glances. The tea table rewarded familiarity and punished deviation, not harshly, but persistently. Over time, people adapted, smoothing themselves into acceptable shapes. Importantly, this process was not always cruel. Many found genuine comfort and belonging at the tea table. Shared routines created trust. Familiar faces created safety. Tea could be a refuge as well as a test. The same structure that enforced norms also offered predictability in a complex world. Yet even kindness at tea followed rules. Sympathy had limits. Support was offered carefully. Strong emotions were moderated. Tea was not a place for extremes. It was a place for balance, control, and mutual reassurance that everything remained, at least outwardly, in order. As afternoon tea became more entrenched, its influence extended beyond the drawing room. Decisions made casually over cups had real consequences. Marriages were discussed. Careers were quietly encouraged or discouraged. Reputations shifted subtly. Tea conversations echoed outward into larger social patterns. The brilliance of afternoon tea as a social tool lay in its invisibility. No one announced its power. No one claimed authority through it. It worked precisely because it appeared harmless. People complied willingly, believing they were simply enjoying a pleasant custom. By the late Victorian period, to understand society was to understand tea. To navigate relationships successfully required fluency in its language. Those who mastered it moved smoothly through social spaces. Those who did not often found doors closing without explanation. So when we picture a Victorian afternoon tea, we should imagine more than porcelain and pastries. We should imagine a quiet arena where identities were shaped, boundaries enforced, and futures gently nudged in one direction or another. All beneath the soft clink of cups and the reassuring promise that this was, after all, just tea. And yet, beneath that promise, everyone knew. The kettle might sing softly, but the room was always listening. Behind every graceful afternoon tea, behind every perfectly timed pour and polished cup, there existed a presence that Victorian society preferred not to acknowledge. The ritual appeared effortless precisely because so much effort was hidden from view. Servants were the invisible architecture of tea culture, supporting its elegance while remaining deliberately unseen. In Victorian London, domestic service was one of the most common forms of employment, particularly for women. Large and small households alike relied on servants to maintain the rhythms of daily life. Tea, for all its refinement, was labor-intensive. Water had to be carried, kettles heated, cups cleaned, linens pressed, trays balanced, and rooms arranged. None of this happened on its own. The timing alone required precision. Tea was expected to appear at just the right moment, not early, not late. Too early suggested impatience. Too late suggested disorder. Servants learned to measure time not by clocks, but by social cues, the sound of voices settling, the host's posture, the shift in conversation. They worked around the moods of others, often anticipating needs before they were spoken. This anticipation was a skill developed through repetition and restraint. Servants were trained to notice everything and acknowledge nothing. A spilled drop, a chipped cup, a hesitation in movement, any of these could disrupt the illusion of calm. The success of tea depended on smoothness, and smoothness depended on labor that erased itself as it worked. Physical conditions behind the scenes were rarely comfortable. Kitchens were hot, cramped, and busy. Carrying heavy kettles required strength and balance. Mistakes could lead to scolding or worse, yet praise was rare. When tea proceeded flawlessly, it was attributed to good taste or proper upbringing, never to the hands that made it possible. Silence was part of the job. Servants were expected to move quietly, speak softly, and disappear when not needed. Their presence was tolerated only insofar as it did not interrupt conversation. To be noticed was often to have failed. This expectation shaped behavior deeply, encouraging careful movement and emotional restraint. Yet servants heard everything. Conversations at tea tables were rarely private. Opinions, plans, judgments, and worries drifted freely, carried by the assumption that no one important was listening. Servants absorbed these details while pretending not to exist. This knowledge gave them a unique, often heavy perspective on the households they served. Despite this, the social structure ensured that servants' insight did not translate into influence. Their role was to maintain appearances, not challenge them. Tea culture depended on this imbalance. The illusion of equality among guests required a foundation of inequality beneath them. For many servants, tea time was one of the most demanding parts of the day. Unlike other tasks that could be done away from watchful eyes, tea service occurred in full view. Every movement was subject to scrutiny. Hands were expected to be steady. Expressions neutral. Even fatigue had to be hidden. The irony was sharp. Tea symbolized calm and control, yet it was produced through effort and tension. The serenity enjoyed by guests was made possible by others suppressing their own discomfort. Victorian society accepted this without question, framing it as natural order rather than choice. Servants were also responsible for maintaining the objects that gave tea its symbolic power. Fine china required careful handling. Silverware needed constant polishing. Table linens demanded washing and pressing. A single stain or scratch could reflect poorly on the household, and by extension, on the servant responsible. This responsibility created a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Accidents happened, despite care. When they did, the consequences were rarely gentle. Replacement costs could be deducted from wages. Reputations could suffer. In a world where employment was precarious, a mistake at tea could echo far beyond a single afternoon. Yet many servants took pride in their work. Mastery of tea service was a mark of professionalism. Knowing the preferences of the household, anticipating guests' needs, and executing service smoothly offered a sense of competence in a system that offered few rewards. Pride, like labor, was quietly contained. The emotional distance enforced by tea rituals also protected servants in subtle ways. By limiting interaction, the system reduced opportunities for conflict. Clear boundaries defined expectations. Servants were not expected to participate socially. Their success lay in facilitating others' interactions. Still, this separation reinforced a rigid hierarchy. Tea culture taught everyone their place repeatedly. Guests learned to expect service without acknowledgement. Hosts learned to command without overt instruction. Servants learned to comply without complaint. The ritual rehearsed social order daily. As tea became more elaborate, so did the demands placed on servants. Multiple courses, specialized utensils, and decorative displays increased complexity. Each edition promised greater refinement while requiring more unseen effort. The aesthetic of ease grew heavier with labor. Public tea spaces mirrored this dynamic. Tea rooms and gardens employed staff to manage crowds while maintaining decorum. Here too, workers remained peripheral, ensuring that visitors could enjoy leisure uninterrupted. The pattern repeated: comfort above, effort below. The invisibility of servants was not accidental. It was cultivated. Victorian ideals prized self-sufficiency and moral order, even as they relied on extensive support. Tea exemplified this contradiction. It appeared simple and wholesome while resting on a complex network of work. Over time, this normalization shaped attitudes toward labor itself. Because tea was pleasant, the work behind it seemed acceptable, even benign. The ritual softened awareness of inequality, making it feel orderly rather than harsh. And yet, if one looks closely, the strain is there. In the careful steps, in the controlled movements, in the quiet readiness to respond instantly. Tea culture demanded discipline not only from guests, but from those who served them, often to a greater degree. So when we imagine a Victorian tea table, perfectly arranged and gently humming with conversation, we should also imagine the unseen choreography surrounding it. The hands that lifted kettles. The eyes that watched for cues. The effort that vanished the moment it succeeded. Tea was a performance, and like all performances, it relied on people who remained out of the spotlight. Their absence from the story was part of the story itself. Without them, the ritual would collapse. With them, it appeared effortless. And so the kettle sang again, cups were refilled, and the illusion held supported quietly, faithfully, and almost invisibly, by those who made refinement possible without ever being invited to enjoy it. As the ritual of tea grew more refined, the focus shifted from who attended and who served to how everything was done. In Victorian London, making tea was not a casual act. It was a procedure governed by rules so precise that they could turn an ordinary afternoon into a source of quiet tension. What appeared gentle and soothing on the surface was, beneath it, an exercise in exactness. The process began with water, but even this simplest element carried expectations. Water had to be fresh, not reheated, not drawn too early. Reboiled water was believed to ruin the taste and, by extension, reveal carelessness. The kettle itself mattered. Cleanliness was essential. Any trace of residue suggested neglect. Before a single leaf touched the pot, judgment had already begun. Tea leaves were chosen with care. Their origin, quality, and freshness were all scrutinized. Offering inferior tea implied either ignorance or indifference, neither of which reflected well on a host. Too strong a brew suggested aggression or lack of refinement. Too weak a brew implied hesitation or poor judgment. Balance was everything, and balance was difficult to achieve consistently. The teapot required warming before use, a step that could not be skipped without consequences. This small act symbolized preparation and respect for the ritual. Forgetting it was not dramatic, but it was noticeable. Guests might not comment, but they would remember. Tea, in this sense, trained memory as much as taste. Timing was another source of anxiety. Leaves left too long produced bitterness. Removed too early, they produced disappointment. The host was expected to know instinctively when the tea was ready. Clocks existed, but reliance on them felt mechanical. Skill was demonstrated through intuition, not measurement. Even the act of pouring carried meaning. The stream of tea was expected to be steady and controlled. A shaky hand suggested nervousness. An overly confident pour risked spilling. Guests watched, often unconsciously, absorbing impressions that would linger beyond the cup. Milk, perhaps more than any other element, became a quiet battlefield of opinion. Whether milk should be added before or after tea was a matter of deep social signaling. It was not simply preference. It suggested background, upbringing, and awareness of tradition. Choosing incorrectly for the wrong audience could create silent discomfort. Sugar, too, required moderation. 1 cube was acceptable. 2 raised questions. More than that invited assumptions. The host did not comment, but the choice was noted. Tea allowed people to express individuality within narrow limits, and stepping outside those limits attracted attention. Spoons were placed deliberately. Stirring was gentle, never clinking loudly against porcelain. The spoon was returned to the saucer, not left in the cup. Each movement had a correct version, learned through observation rather than instruction. Errors were rarely corrected openly, but they were registered. All of this precision created a strange emotional atmosphere. Tea was meant to be relaxing, yet it demanded focus. Hosts, especially, carried the weight of responsibility. A successful tea passed without remark. A flawed one left behind a residue of self-doubt. This pressure was intensified by repetition. Tea happened, often, which meant mistakes could recur. Consistency became a measure of character. Someone who always brewed tea well was seen as reliable. Someone who did not was quietly categorized. The irony was that most guests would have accepted imperfect tea gladly. But Victorian society was not driven by necessity. It was driven by signaling. Tea was a language, and accuracy mattered. To speak it poorly suggested deeper inadequacies. This exactness extended to temperature. Tea served too hot forced awkward waiting. Too cool suggested delay. The cup itself mattered, thin enough to cool properly, but not so thin as to feel fragile. Each choice layered meaning onto experience. Hosts were often caught between their own preferences and expectations. Perhaps they liked stronger tea. Perhaps they preferred more sugar. But hosting required adaptation. Tea was not about self-expression. It was about social harmony, even at the cost of personal taste. Guests, too, participated in this tension. Compliments were expected, but excessive praise felt insincere. Criticism was unacceptable. Silence could be interpreted either way. Everyone navigated these subtleties carefully, aware that tea created impressions that extended beyond the table. Over time, this careful choreography became internalized. People stopped thinking about the steps consciously. The body remembered what to do. Hands moved automatically. This automation masked the effort involved, making the ritual appear natural rather than learned. Yet the anxiety never fully disappeared. New guests, unfamiliar settings, or unfamiliar blends could unsettle even experienced hosts. Tea's simplicity was deceptive. Small changes carried disproportionate weight. This complexity also reinforced social boundaries. Those raised with tea culture absorbed its rules early. Those who encountered it later faced a steep learning curve. Mistakes marked them as outsiders, regardless of their intelligence or goodwill. Tea thus became a test disguised as hospitality. Passing it required knowledge, practice, and composure. Failing it rarely led to confrontation, but it shaped reputation all the same. In this way, the act of brewing tea mirrored Victorian ideals more broadly. Precision, restraint, and self-control were prized. Errors were tolerated quietly but remembered. Excellence was expected without acknowledgement. And so, each afternoon, countless hosts across London approached the kettle with a mix of calm and concern. The leaves were measured. The water boiled. The pot was warmed. The ritual unfolded once more, balancing comfort against scrutiny. Tea promised ease, but it demanded care. It soothed, but it also evaluated. In mastering its rules, Victorians practiced mastering themselves. And when the final cup was poured, when the conversation drifted on, and when the guests appeared content, the greatest success was not applause or praise. It was the absence of notice. The knowledge that nothing had gone wrong. In Victorian tea culture, that silence was the highest compliment of all. Once the rules of tea were learned, they did not disappear. Instead, they settled into the background, quietly waiting to be tested in the smallest of details. In Victorian London, it was rarely the large gestures that defined a person at the tea table. It was the minor choices, the nearly invisible decisions, that carried the most weight. Tea culture trained people to notice what most would overlook. The placement of milk, the amount of sugar, the angle of a cup. These details were not trivial. They functioned as social signals, readable to those who knew how to look. A guest did not need to announce their background or values. Tea revealed them gently, through habit rather than declaration. Milk, in particular, became a quiet source of distinction. Some added it first, some after. Each choice suggested familiarity with certain traditions and disregard for others. Neither was openly condemned, yet each was quietly associated with class, upbringing, and awareness. Guests learned to adjust their behavior depending on whose table they sat at, a skill that required constant attention. Sugar followed similar rules. Choosing how much to add was a moment of exposure. Too little could suggest austerity or affectation. Too much implied indulgence or lack of restraint. Moderation was praised, though rarely stated. Guests who hesitated before adding sugar revealed uncertainty. Those who added it without pause revealed confidence, whether justified or not. Even the act of stirring was observed. Stirring too quickly created noise. Stirring too slowly suggested discomfort. The spoon's journey mattered as much as the destination. When it was returned to the saucer, its placement signaled familiarity. Left in the cup, it quietly marked inexperience. These judgments were not announced. They did not need to be. Tea culture relied on shared understanding. People learned early that reactions were subtle. Approval came in the form of continued invitations. Disapproval arrived as absence. This constant evaluation created a peculiar form of social awareness. Guests monitored themselves while appearing relaxed. They adjusted mid-action, correcting gestures almost unconsciously. Tea required a kind of double attention, one part enjoying the moment, another scanning for error. Hosts participated in this observation as well. They noted guests' habits, filing them away as information. Preferences were remembered, sometimes as kindness, sometimes as data. A guest who consistently behaved awkwardly might be invited less often. A guest who moved with ease became welcome. Small details also shaped narratives beyond the table. Stories circulated, gently edited, about how someone behaved at tea. These stories rarely mentioned tea explicitly. Instead, they hinted at character. Someone was described as a bit uncertain or not quite comfortable. The meaning was understood. The power of these minor judgments lay in their persistence. One misstep could be overlooked. Repeated ones became identity. Tea did not punish loudly. It taught slowly. Children absorbed this lesson early. Watching adults, they learned that restraint was valued. That taking up too much space, even in gesture, was risky. Tea time became an informal classroom where social literacy was taught through example rather than instruction. This focus on detail reinforced conformity. Guests learned which behaviors blended in and which stood out. Over time, many adjusted not because they believed the rules mattered, but because the cost of deviation was isolation. Tea encouraged self-editing. At the same time, this system created anxiety. Knowing that every small action might be interpreted made relaxation difficult. Tea promised comfort but delivered scrutiny. The safer one wished to feel, the more carefully one behaved. Yet there was also reassurance in knowing the rules. Mastery brought ease. Those who understood the signals could move through tea gatherings with confidence. Familiarity transformed vigilance into habit. What once required thought became instinct. This distinction separated insiders from outsiders. Knowledge of tea details functioned as social currency. Those without it struggled, even if they were kind or intelligent. Tea valued fluency over sincerity. Importantly, this evaluation rarely involved cruelty. Most participants believed they were simply upholding standards. The harm, when it occurred, was indirect. Exclusion felt natural, not intentional. Tea culture diffused responsibility across many small choices. Over time, these minor judgments reinforced broader social patterns. They supported class boundaries, shaped friendships, and influenced opportunities. Tea became a quiet gatekeeper, determining who belonged where. The elegance of this system lay in its subtlety. No one needed to enforce the rules openly. Participants enforced them themselves, motivated by the desire to fit in. Tea culture thus sustained itself with minimal effort. And so, in drawing rooms across Victorian London, people lifted cups, added milk, stirred gently, and placed spoons just so. Each movement seemed insignificant. Each carried meaning. Tea taught that in a society obsessed with order, the smallest actions mattered most. It trained attention, rewarded conformity, and turned ordinary gestures into symbols of belonging. By the time the cups were emptied and the conversation drifted on, judgments had already been made. They lingered quietly, shaping future interactions. Nothing dramatic had happened. No voices were raised. No rules were stated. And yet, everything had been noted. As attention lingered on these small gestures, it became clear that afternoon tea was not merely a gathering of individuals, but a carefully arranged field of quiet power. Beneath the appearance of ease and politeness, the tea table functioned as a subtle battlefield, where authority was displayed not through commands, but through positioning. Every chair, every pour, every pause communicated rank. Seating was never accidental. The placement of chairs followed an unspoken logic understood by all present. The most respected guests were offered the most comfortable positions, often closest to the host. Those of lesser importance were placed farther away, still included, but gently reminded of their place. No one announced these distinctions. They were accepted as natural. The host's position was central, both physically and socially. From this vantage point, the host controlled the flow of tea, conversation, and attention. To pour tea was to exercise authority. It required composure and confidence, signaling that the host belonged at the center of the gathering. Delegating the pour, or hesitating to begin, altered perceptions immediately. Guests noticed who was served first. This order reflected priority, familiarity, and respect. Being served early suggested importance. Being served later suggested patience was expected. Complaints were unthinkable. Acceptance reinforced the hierarchy. Even the act of refilling cups carried meaning. A guest whose cup was refilled promptly was valued. One whose cup sat empty for too long might feel overlooked. These moments were small, but cumulative. They shaped how people felt about their standing long after the tea ended. Conversation followed similar patterns. Some voices carried more weight. Others spoke cautiously, aware that interrupting or dominating could shift perception. The tea table encouraged balance, but not equality. Authority flowed quietly, shaping who led discussions and who followed. Power at tea was often exercised through restraint. The ability to remain calm, to speak sparingly, to listen attentively, suggested confidence. Those who sought attention too eagerly risked appearing insecure. Tea rewarded subtle control. Women, particularly hosts, wielded significant influence in these settings. Through invitation lists, seating choices, and conversational cues, they shaped social networks. Their power was domestic in form, but real in effect. Tea allowed them to manage relationships while appearing merely gracious. Men navigated this space carefully. Dominance that worked elsewhere could feel inappropriate at tea. Successful participation required adaptation. Those who understood this demonstrated social intelligence. Those who did not risked discomfort. The tea table thus became a place where power was practiced daily. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Relationships were strengthened or weakened through repeated interactions. Authority was affirmed through consistency. This subtle contest was rarely hostile. Most participants accepted the rules willingly. Tea offered structure, and structure offered security. Knowing where one stood reduced uncertainty, even if it limited ambition. Yet tension existed beneath the calm. Guests monitored their behavior, gauging reactions. Hosts balanced hospitality with control. Everyone played a role, aware that missteps could alter future invitations. Tea's power lay in its repetition. One gathering might mean little. Many gatherings established patterns. Over time, these patterns felt inevitable. Tea made hierarchy feel natural. The battlefield metaphor is useful not because tea was aggressive, but because it involved strategy. Decisions were made quietly. Moves were subtle. Outcomes were rarely immediate, but they endured. In this environment, politeness functioned as armor. Smiles concealed calculations. Compliments softened boundaries. Tea allowed competition to exist without confrontation. And when the cups were cleared and the guests departed, the effects remained. Perceptions had shifted slightly. Alliances adjusted. The next tea would reflect these changes. Thus, afternoon tea was never simply about refreshment. It was a daily rehearsal of power, conducted with grace and restraint. A place where influence was poured cup by cup. The table was cleared. The kettle cooled. But the quiet contest continued, waiting patiently for the next invitation. As these quiet rituals settled into everyday life, their influence began to stretch far beyond individual households. What started as custom gradually hardened into expectation, and expectation, when repeated often enough, becomes culture. In Victorian Britain, No single figure shaped this transformation more quietly and more thoroughly than Queen Victoria herself. Her personal habits, preferences, and public image gave tea an authority that no rulebook could ever achieve. The monarch did not need to issue decrees about tea. She did something far more effective: she participated. Her routine, carefully observed and endlessly discussed, became a template. When Queen Victoria drank tea, tea became not merely fashionable but respectable. Her choices suggested stability, continuity, and moral order, qualities deeply valued in a society navigating rapid change. Reports of the Queen's daily life circulated widely, carried by newspapers, memoirs, and polite conversation. The public learned when she took tea, how she served it, and with whom. These details were repeated not because they were dramatic, but because they were reassuring. They suggested that even at the highest level of power, life followed orderly rhythms. Tea, already embedded in domestic life, gained new symbolic weight through this association. It became linked to loyalty, tradition, and national identity. To participate in tea culture was, in a small but meaningful way, to align oneself with the values represented by the crown. Manufacturers understood this immediately. Tea merchants, porcelain makers, and silver producers eagerly highlighted royal associations. Products were marketed as suitable for refined households, echoing the tastes attributed to the Queen. Ownership became a form of participation in a shared national narrative. This influence extended across class lines. While not everyone could afford fine china or imported blends, the idea of tea as a daily ritual became universal. It crossed boundaries of wealth and region, offering a common practice that felt dignified regardless of scale. A modest cup could still carry royal meaning. The Queen's endorsement also stabilized tea's social role. In a period marked by political reform, industrial upheaval, and shifting class structures, tea represented continuity. It offered something familiar in an unfamiliar world. The monarchy's steady image reinforced this sense of reassurance. Importantly, royal influence softened conflict within tea culture. Disagreements over etiquette, taste, or tradition were often resolved by reference to what was considered proper or traditional, terms shaped by royal example. Tea thus became less negotiable, more fixed. Public events reinforced this symbolism. Large gatherings, exhibitions, and celebrations often included tea as a central feature. These moments linked private habit to public identity. Tea was no longer just domestic. It was national. The Queen's long reign amplified this effect. Generations grew up knowing no other monarch. Tea rituals passed from parents to children under a stable royal image. Over time, tea became intertwined with memory itself. It felt timeless. This association also influenced behavior abroad. As Britain's presence expanded globally, tea traveled with it. Colonial administrators, merchants, and travelers carried tea habits overseas, presenting them as markers of civility and order. Tea thus became a cultural ambassador, shaped by domestic tradition and royal approval. At home, tea gatherings increasingly mirrored the values associated with the Queen: moderation, restraint, and dignity. Excess was discouraged. Simplicity was praised. Tea became a daily reminder of ideal conduct. Critically, this influence worked precisely because it was indirect. No one felt forced. Participation was voluntary, yet deviation felt uncomfortable. Tea's authority came from example, not enforcement. Over time, royal tea habits faded into background knowledge. Few remembered specific details. What remained was the sense that tea was how things were done. This naturalization marked the ritual's complete integration into society. Tea no longer needed explanation. It was expected. Its absence felt wrong. Its presence reassured. Thus, Queen Victoria's quiet participation transformed tea from a social custom into a cultural institution. Without speeches or mandates, she anchored it firmly within British identity. And as afternoon shadows lengthened across drawing rooms and kitchens alike, tea continued to be poured not just in imitation, but in inheritance, carrying with it the weight of tradition, memory, and a sense that some things, at least, could remain steady in a changing world. The kettle boiled again, not only for comfort or conversation, but as part of something larger, a shared rhythm that bound individuals to a nation, one careful cup at a time. As tea settled into the heart of British identity, it carried with it a story that stretched far beyond the drawing rooms of London. Every cup poured in a quiet afternoon carried echoes of distant places, long journeys, and vast systems that most drinkers never saw. Tea culture, for all its domestic calm, was inseparable from the reach of the British Empire. By the 19th century, tea was no longer a rare luxury. It had become a daily necessity for millions. This transformation required vast amounts of land, labor, transport, and organization. The smooth predictability of tea time in London depended on a global network that operated with relentless regularity. Leaves were grown far from the city's foggy streets, cultivated in regions with climates suited to the plant. These landscapes were reshaped to meet demand. Hillsides were cleared. Fields were organized. Schedules were imposed. The steady rhythm of tea at home was mirrored by steady routines abroad, often under very different conditions. For the average Victorian tea drinker, these origins remained abstract. Tea arrived neatly packaged, its journey invisible. This distance made it easier to treat tea as a natural part of life rather than the result of complex global systems. The ritual felt timeless, even though its supply depended on modern logistics and expanding influence. Trade routes connected ports, ships, warehouses, and markets in a continuous chain. Delays mattered. Disruptions were noticed quickly. A shortage of tea would have unsettled daily life far more than many political changes. This reliance quietly reinforced the importance of maintaining those roots and the structures that supported them. Tea thus became more than a commodity. It was a stabilizing force. Keeping tea flowing meant keeping daily life orderly. This idea shaped priorities at every level, from merchants to policymakers. The domestic comfort of tea justified extraordinary effort to ensure its availability. The language surrounding tea often avoided complexity. Advertisements emphasized purity, quality, and refinement. Packaging highlighted tradition and respectability. Rarely did it mention distance or labor. The focus remained on the cup, not the chain behind it. This selective attention was not unique to tea, but tea's intimacy made it especially powerful. Because it was consumed daily, it felt personal. Because it felt personal, its broader implications were easier to ignore. Tea allowed empire to be experienced as comfort rather than control. At home, tea reinforced a sense of order and civility. Abroad, it represented British presence and influence. Serving tea in distant territories signaled familiarity and authority. It marked spaces as governed, organized, and connected to a larger system. Yet this global reach also introduced contradictions. Tea symbolized calm, yet its production required discipline and endurance. Tea symbolized gentleness, yet its expansion reshaped entire regions. These contrasts were rarely discussed at the tea table. The ritual softened awareness of them. Education reinforced this separation. Children learned tea manners before learning geography. They understood how to hold a cup long before understanding where its contents came from. Tea culture trained focus inward toward behavior rather than outward toward origins. Even when people were aware that tea came from far away, this knowledge remained vague. Distance reduced urgency. The journey felt romantic rather than practical. Tea's global story became background texture rather than subject. The empire, like tea, relied on routine. Ships departed on schedule. Warehouses counted inventory. Markets adjusted prices. These systems operated quietly, much like servants at the tea table. Their success lay in remaining unnoticed. This invisibility created moral distance. The pleasantness of tea discouraged difficult questions. The ritual framed consumption as innocent. People did not see themselves as participants in something vast. They saw themselves as enjoying a simple habit. Over time, tea helped normalize Britain's global reach. It entered homes daily, making the idea of distant connections feel ordinary. Empire became part of routine rather than exception. At the same time, tea unified diverse populations at home. Across class lines, people drank tea. This shared practice created a sense of common identity, even as it depended on unequal systems elsewhere. Tea made belonging feel inclusive. Public spaces reinforced this connection. Tea rooms and exhibitions celebrated the product as a national treasure. Displays highlighted variety and abundance. They framed tea as evidence of Britain's organization and reach. Critically, tea culture did not require people to approve of empire explicitly. Participation was passive. Drinking tea did not feel political. This neutrality made it effective. Empire entered daily life quietly, without debate. As decades passed, the association deepened. Tea became inseparable from ideas of home, comfort, and normalcy. Questioning it felt unnecessary. The system worked. The kettle boiled. Life continued. Yet beneath this calm, the scale remained immense. Each cup represented coordination across continents. Each afternoon ritual depended on structures far removed from the quiet room in which it was enjoyed. Understanding this does not disrupt the comfort tea provided, but it adds depth to it. Tea was both intimate and global, personal and expansive, gentle and far-reaching. As evening approached and cups were cleared, the empire did not intrude on conversation. It remained present without being named, woven into habit rather than thought. And so, Victorian tea culture rested on a foundation that extended far beyond sight, linking domestic life to distant landscapes through repetition and routine. The kettle boiled once more, and the world, vast and interconnected, was reduced again to something simple, familiar, and warm, held carefully between two hands. As the ritual of tea expanded, it became clear that its power was as much in the material world as in conversation or custom. Objects mattered. Not simply as tools, but as symbols. Cups, saucers, teapots, trays, and spoons carried meaning as carefully as the gestures of pouring or stirring. Fine china was among the most visible markers of respectability. Its thinness, translucence, and decoration signaled refinement. A delicate cup suggested care and familiarity with tradition. Heavier, coarser pieces hinted at practicality rather than elegance. Guests noticed immediately, often without conscious thought. Ownership of a complete tea set implied stability. It suggested that a household was settled, organized, and prepared to receive others. Missing pieces disrupted this impression. A mismatched cup or chipped saucer drew attention, not because it affected the taste of tea, but because it interrupted the visual language of order. Silverware carried similar weight. Polished spoons and tongs reflected light and intention. Their shine suggested time spent maintaining appearances. Dull or worn utensils implied neglect. In a culture where character was inferred from surfaces, these details mattered. Tea trays were chosen with care. Wood, metal, or lacquer each conveyed subtle messages. The tray framed the ritual, presenting tea as an event rather than a necessity. Its condition spoke quietly about the household's standards. These objects demanded constant attention. China was washed carefully to avoid cracks. silver polished to prevent tarnish, linens laundered and pressed. This labor was measured by invisibility. Well-kept objects drew no comment, poorly kept ones lingered in memory. The fragility of these items mirrored the fragility of reputation. A dropped cup or broken handle could carry disproportionate social weight. Replacement was costly. Loss mattered materially and socially. For hosts, displaying fine teaware was calculated. It signaled taste and risk. Using delicate pieces demonstrated confidence. Reserving them suggested caution. Guests interacted carefully with the objects. 2. Improper handling risked embarrassment. The potential for damage added tension, reinforcing ideals of restraint and control. Tea objects allowed social aspiration. Middle-class households invested in china and silver to align themselves with higher standards. Possessing the right object suggested belonging, even if other markers were absent. Teaware became a bridge between classes. Manufacturers responded eagerly. Designs multiplied. Prices varied. Advertising emphasized elegance and tradition. Owning the right set became a visible sign of refinement and ambition. Public tea spaces amplified this symbolism. Tea rooms displayed their finest pieces prominently. Patrons judged establishments by presentation as much as taste. Objects created atmosphere, signaling respectability and care. Teaware accumulated history. Sets were gifted, inherited, commemorative. They marked milestones, marriages, anniversaries, achievements. Objects connected tea to memory, deepening its emotional resonance. At the same time, this focus reinforced exclusion. Those unable to afford or maintain such items felt pressure. Tea promised universality, but symbols reminded all of difference. The quiet power of tea objects lay in permanence. While conversation faded, china remained. While moods shifted, silver endured. These items anchored ritual in physical form. As guests departed and cups were washed, the objects returned to their places, waiting for the next gathering. Their presence reassured hosts that order could be restored, even if interactions were unpredictable. Tea culture was as much about what sat on the table as who sat around it. Objects spoke silently, reinforcing care, stability, and refinement. The kettle cooled. The china rested. And the symbols of respectability remained, ready to be arranged once more, promising that with the right objects, the ritual could begin again. Alongside the cups and saucers, the food carried its own quiet language. At first glance, these bites seemed modest, even underwhelming: thin sandwiches, light pastries, carefully portioned cakes. But in Victorian tea culture, restraint was the message. Portions were deliberately small. Not a mistake, not a limitation. A signal. Large or filling food suggested hunger, urgency, or lack of control. Afternoon tea was not meant to satisfy the body completely. It was meant to demonstrate mastery over appetite. Cucumber sandwiches became iconic because they were understated. Thin slices, lightly seasoned, between delicate bread with crusts removed. No strong flavor distracted. No heaviness lingered. Eating one was refinement, not indulgence. It suggested the guest was there for company, conversation, not nourishment. Scones followed a similar logic. Richer than sandwiches, yet still restrained. Served small, with modest cream or preserve, inviting enjoyment without excess. One or two were enough. Knowing when to stop mattered as much as taste. Cakes, when present, were sliced thinly. Variety was prized over quantity. A small piece allowed sampling without greed. The table offered abundance in appearance, not consumption. This balance reflected broader Victorian values. Self-control praised, excess suspicious. Eating too eagerly at tea risked judgment. Appetite was managed, not displayed. Tea food provided a public lesson in discipline. Hosts planned carefully. Too little seemed stingy. Too much, vulgar. The right amount created an illusion of generosity without indulgence. Guests adapted accordingly. Eating slowly, pausing between bites, conversing while holding food. Finishing quickly suggested impatience. Leaving food untouched implied affectation. The ideal lay somewhere in between. These expectations were rarely spoken. Learned by observation. Children watched adults navigate plates, absorbing lessons on moderation long before understanding intellectually. Tea food reinforced class distinctions. Ingredients were simple, but preparation required time and care. Removing crusts, slicing evenly, arranging attractively signaled leisure and attention. Households managing this regularly demonstrated stability. At the same time, tea food allowed aspiration. Even modest homes could prepare simple sandwiches. The performance of restraint was accessible, if not effortless. Public tea spaces echoed these norms. Tearoom menus emphasized lightness, portions controlled. Eating framed as accompaniment, not focus. Spaces encouraged lingering without consumption, reinforcing tea's social role. The aesthetic of tea food mattered. Presentation outweighed flavor. Symmetry, cleanliness, delicacy conveyed care. Food became visual as much as edible, reinforcing ritual and appearance. This focus created pressure. Hosts worried about balance, timing. Guests worried about behavior. Even enjoyment had rules. Yet many found comfort in these limits. Knowing what was expected reduced uncertainty. Tea food provided a behavioral script. One could participate safely by following it. Over time, these patterns shaped attitudes toward food more broadly. Moderation became respectability. Control, a virtue. Tea taught appetite should never overwhelm decorum. The approach softened social interaction. Light food allowed gatherings to be shorter or longer without discomfort. The ritual adapted to conversation, reinforcing its social framework. As cups were refilled and plates slowly emptied, order remained. Crumbs minimal. Hands clean. The traces of eating kept discreet, mirroring emotional restraint. Tea food completed the ritual. It allowed participation without distraction, enjoyment without excess. It reinforced the notion that refinement lay in knowing when enough was enough. And as the final crumbs were cleared, what remained was balance, not fullness. A quiet signal, at this table, restraint was always on the menu. As tea culture moved beyond private parlors, it did not lose its rules. It simply changed its stage. Public tea gardens and tea rooms emerged as spaces where the ritual could be performed in view of others, transforming tea from a domestic habit into a social spectacle. These spaces were carefully designed. Paths were laid out to encourage strolling rather than rushing. Tables were spaced to allow conversation without intrusion, yet close enough to ensure visibility. To attend a tea garden was not just to drink tea, but to be seen drinking it. Appearance mattered deeply. Clothing, posture, and timing all contributed to the impression one made. Arriving too early suggested eagerness. Arriving too late suggested disregard. The ideal guest appeared effortlessly punctual, as though drawn there naturally by the rhythm of the day. Tea gardens offered a rare blend of privacy and exposure. One could sit with friends, yet remain part of a larger audience. Conversations were softer, gestures more deliberate. Even laughter was measured, never too loud, never too restrained. These spaces allowed a wider range of society to observe and imitate elite behavior. One did not need a private drawing room to participate in tea culture. A table in a public garden offered access to the same rituals, albeit under watchful eyes. This visibility introduced new pressures. In private homes, Mistakes might be forgiven or forgotten. In public spaces, they lingered. A clumsy movement, an awkward pause, an unfamiliarity with etiquette could be noticed, remembered, quietly judged. Yet this risk was part of the appeal. To navigate a tea garden successfully was to demonstrate social competence. It showed one could move comfortably within shared norms, even under observation. Tea gardens also softened social boundaries. Different classes could occupy the same space, though rarely the same table. Proximity allowed comparison without direct interaction. One could observe others' manners, clothing, and confidence, learning without instruction. Music often played in the background, adding rhythm without distraction. The goal was ambiance, not entertainment. Tea gardens were not places of excitement, but of gentle engagement. They encouraged lingering, watching, reflecting. The act of being seen became as important as the tea itself. People walked slowly, chose seats carefully, and positioned themselves to be noticed without appearing to seek attention. The balance was delicate. Too much display felt improper. Too little risked invisibility. Tea rooms followed similar principles indoors. Windows framed patrons like portraits. Tables faced outward. The ritual unfolded against a backdrop of public life. Tea became a bridge between private behavior and public identity. For many, these spaces offered a sense of belonging. Even alone, one could sit with a cup of tea and feel part of something larger. The shared ritual connected strangers without conversation. At the same time, tea gardens reinforced social memory. Regular visitors recognized one another. Familiar faces became part of the scenery. Reputation formed slowly, through consistency rather than drama. Staff in these spaces managed the flow with subtlety. Service was prompt but unobtrusive. The goal was to support the ritual without disrupting it. Even clearing tables followed a quiet choreography. Seasonal changes altered the experience. In warmer months, gardens bloomed, enhancing the sense of leisure. In cooler weather, indoor tea rooms provided shelter and continuity. Tea adapted, always offering stability amid change. These public spaces also reflected broader shifts in society. As cities grew, tea gardens offered a controlled environment where order could be maintained. They provided a pause in urban life, a reminder of gentler rhythms. Over time, the popularity of these spaces shaped expectations. Tea became associated not just with home, but with public respectability. One could demonstrate refinement without hosting, simply by participating correctly. The ritual's success lay in its simplicity. A cup, a table, a shared understanding. Everything else was secondary. The setting amplified the meaning, but the core remained unchanged. As the afternoon faded and visitors departed, tea gardens emptied gradually. There was no rush, no clear ending. People left as naturally as they arrived, carrying the experience with them. What lingered was not the taste of tea, but the memory of participation. Of having occupied the space correctly. Of having been part of a scene without disturbing it. In this way, tea gardens completed the arc of Victorian tea culture. From private ritual to public performance, tea shaped how people related to one another, to time, and to themselves. It taught patience. It rewarded observation. It valued balance over excess. And long after the cups were cleared and the tables reset, the lessons remained. Tea had shown how a simple act could carry meaning far beyond the moment. Not because of what was consumed, but because of how it was shared. As we step back from the cups, the tables, and the carefully arranged afternoons, it becomes clear that Victorian tea was never really about tea alone. It was a language. A system of signals. A quiet agreement about how to exist together without speaking too loudly about power, class, or expectation. Every element played its role. The timing. The posture. The food. The spaces, both private and public. Together, they formed a ritual that offered comfort while demanding discipline. Tea provided warmth, but also boundaries. It allowed people to pause, but only in approved ways. In a world changing rapidly, tea offered stability. It marked time gently, dividing long days into manageable moments. It gave structure to afternoons that might otherwise feel endless. And in doing so, it shaped how people understood patience, restraint, and belonging. What makes this ritual endure is not its elegance, but its familiarity. Even now, the act of making tea carries echoes of those earlier expectations. The pause. The quiet. The sense that for a moment, the world can slow down. Perhaps that is why tea remains with us. Not as a performance, but as a habit. A reminder that small, repeated actions can hold meaning far beyond their simplicity. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for allowing this story to unfold slowly. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, feel free to return for more gentle histories and unhurried stories. Until then, take care, and may your next cup of tea be a peaceful one.